Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second annual International eConference on Atheism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, something to keep in mind is that GCRR is not interested in converting or deconverting anybody from any particular belief system. We are strictly an academic institution, and we seek to approach the discussion of God and suffering purely from a scholastic standpoint, whether that standpoint is theistic, atheistic, or something else entirely. Now, that's actually, in fact, one of the greatest things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world with a whole bunch of different backgrounds and traditions, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. Also, as a special gift to everybody, all you have to do is go to gcrr.org, our website, and look up our newest publication called God and Horrendous Suffering. And with that, all you have to do is scroll down to the bottom, and you can download a special sneak preview of the book by clicking the preview button. And if you end up wanting to purchase that book, we do recommend that you go through the GCRR website because our prices are a lot lower. But also, we're going to give you 15% off more than on the retail price. All you have to do is use the promo code SUFFERING, and that's all in lowercase. Use the promo code SUFFERING at checkout. With that said, I would like to introduce you to my good friend and our next presenter, Dr. Mark Karris. Allow me to share my screen so I can give a proper introduction. Dr. Karris's presentation today is called Petitionary Prayer, Problems, Perils, and a More Effective Pathway. Dr. Karris is a licensed marriage and family therapist, ordained pastor, husband, best-selling author, and recording artist. He's a voracious reader and researcher and all-around biophilic. He is the author of Religious Refugees, Deconstructing Towards Spiritual and Emotional Healing, one of my favorite books of all time. And he is also the author of Divine Echoes, Reconciling Prayer with the Uncontrolling Love of God. We are so lucky to have him here today. Thank you so much for doing this. You have the floor, sir.
Darren, I can't help but feel so appreciative of one of my favorite books of all time. That's quite an honor. Thank you for that. It's great to be here. I'm very excited to share with you. Let me share my screen, and we're going to have some PowerPoint. It's the professor mindset in me. So hopefully that's working. And so today I'm going to be talking about the beauty and the power of prayer. I'm just kidding. It's a joke. I am being a little feisty today, and we'll be talking about, let's see if I can change the settings here so I can see. Here we go. Right. So we'll be talking about petitionary prayer, problems, perils, and a more effective pathway. My favorite part of something like this actually is the discussion. I put way more slides than is necessary. My hope is that it stirs conversation, and I'm probably more excited about getting into that. So we'll have, I'll make sure I make plenty of time for that to happen. So. Some of this is coming from Divine Echoes, and I'm sort of an interesting person. I'm an atheist, but probably different than many other atheists in that I'm an /theist in that I just believe in the God that I affirm, which necessitates I still affirm some sort of divinity, ground of all being, something unnameable, probably very open and friendly with apophatic theology. At the same time, I must say some things about God. And so that's kind of where I'm landing. I'm in this middle space. Atheists are not very fond of me yet. Some of my material they are, and certain theists, well, I've been kicked out of many churches, and some will have me. And so I probably fall under the open and relational theology, process theology umbrella to some degree. So today we'll be talking about the nature of petitionary prayer, examine theological and philosophical pitfalls of petitionary prayer, explore empirical and vital individual and societal concerns about petitionary prayer. And I think for me, this is where I think it most aligns with the theme of this conference, which is God and suffering. And then we have some other points about some reflections on petitionary prayer in the Bible, and discuss a non-traditional theistic and non-theistic model of petitionary prayer. So how did I become interested in this topic? Well, I became a Christian at the age of 21, immersed in sort of it was a oneness Pentecostal tradition. So boy, did they believe in the power of prayer. We screamed, we wailed, we begged, we pleaded with every ounce of our being to the point of sweating and hurting our throats. We were very passionate about prayer. At the time, my mom, when I became a Christian, was addicted to drugs. She was addicted to drugs probably as long as I can remember. And I remember praying fervently for her. She did the best that she could with the tools that she had. And I just remember constantly praying, a lot of fasting. And sometimes, there were glimmers of hope. She came to some church services. We were going at least 3, sometimes 4 days a week at that point. And sometime, I thought, wow, she's going to be, quote, saved. And it never happened. Unfortunately, after all these prayers, and I never gave up, year after year after year, she died from a drug overdose. And she wasn't the only family member I was praying for. That's my incredible, loving, passionate adventurer, my younger brother. And at some point at the age, which is as a therapist, I know this, that the average onset of schizophrenia is around 21. He was 21 when I came home from work one day. I found all his belongings on the side of the curb, and I thought that was quite strange. And then I went upstairs and I looked in his room, and it was empty, and he was in the corner, curled up in a ball, naked, saying things that were incoherent. That was the end of my brother as we knew him. Constant cycle of medication, get off medication because I don't have a problem, do something stupid, get arrested, get back on medication, and the whole cyclical, until the point he murdered somebody in prison, and he will spend the rest of his life in prison. The reason why I'm saying this is because these two events of my mom and my brother were huge catalysts for, the specter that haunted me. And Dallas Willard said this quote, the idea that everything would happen exactly as it does, regardless of whether we pray or not, is a specter that haunts the minds of many who sincerely profess belief in God and makes prayer psychologically impossible, replacing it with dead ritual at best. There was a specter I couldn't get rid of. And as I was deconstructing my faith, in my latest book is Religious Refugees, deconstructing, helping those who are deconstructing, reconstructing their faith. But I thought, what is going on with prayer? Like, does it work? Is it effective? And is it causing more harm than good? I started really asking these tough questions about prayer. And so the Divine Echoes is sort of the investigation in sort of deconstructing in my attempt to reconstruct petitionary prayer. And so I'm going to talk about that today and some conclusions I came to. And like I said, I'm still sort of in the realm of Christian faith, and I'm not very liked, as you will see. And I got kicked out of the church I was in because my views on petitionary prayer. And we're going to unpack some of the things that I've been wrestling with here. And I look forward to discussing that. So it's important to have some sort of operational definition of petitionary prayer, all kinds of prayers, and prayers of lament and prayers of thanksgiving, prayers of praise, and all kinds of prayers. But I'm talking about petitionary prayer, talking to God and asking God to love in a specific matter in which God was not doing so beforehand. Some might say that, we can petition God to do something he's already doing, which is fine. And I agree with that. I think most petitionary prayers are sort of doing this. God, can you do this? Can you do that? In which we'll have some examples. Heal my grandmother from COVID. God, save my brother. God, pour out your love and comfort on Sarah. Here's a pretty well-known one. God, give the doctors wisdom. God, please bring peace to that war-torn nation. I have been in hundreds of prayer meetings, and this is sort of these kinds of prayers that we would pray. And in my own room, and many of those who have experience praying in their maybe formal lives as religious folks, or maybe some of you may do that now, this is the essence of petitionary prayer. God, you do this, right? And we're going to talk about some of the potential problems here, theological and philosophical pitfalls. I could talk about so many. I only have time to talk about a few, but these are some of the ones that I was thinking about. Just talking to an omniscient and loving God about something God is fully aware of, to encourage God to love more effectively, especially when, in the certain faith tradition, God is love. Does it even sound rational? Does it make sense? And when I say talking, prayer in its simplest form is human beings sort of talking to God. We're asking God for help, but at the, elementary level, people are talking to God, right? We're just saying words to God, and we're asking God to do things that God was not doing beforehand. But there's something a little bit irrational about this whole venture here. I think of a megachurch praying for John, who was dying from COVID, week after week after week. I mean, hundreds and thousands of people really praying, really going for it, going into their, entering into the gates of heaven and taking it by storm. And then the pastor says, John passed. And then he gets up, the week that after John passed, and he says, he died from COVID. Let us now pray that God would offer comfort and provide for their family. Most Christians would say, oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, beautiful hearts. I mean, they care about John's family, and they want this God who they believe is all powerful and all knowing and all loving to do something to offer comfort, provide for their family. But then this one person gets up and he stands up in the midst of the congregation, and this is his idea of a prayer of protest. And he says, hold on, I'm having a lot of cognitive dissonance here. Over the last few weeks, there were over 1,000 people praying for John to become well and live. God had the power to instantly heal John, but chose to ignore thousands of our prayers. And after a few weeks of suffering, John tragically died. And now you want me to beg God to lovingly comfort and provide for his family? I'm supposed to trust that an omnipotent and loving God who simply watched John's slow death unfold and did nothing, and who silently watched us cry, wail, and grovel for weeks. You wish he would have, whispered to a few prophets, hey guys, don't waste your time crying and begging me. It will be to no avail. Really spend your time doing something else. This God would open up his stingy hands and unfold his stiff arms to miraculously download comfort or finances to their family members. Like this does not make sense. And this is part of the problem, is that prayer, it's sort of on this particular level, we just accept it. And, I remember one author saying, we've been praying since we've been sentient and breathing. I mean, prayer is as ancient as humans been, carving on cave walls. It's just so like in the DNA of human beings to reach out, especially when you think of back in the day. And, well, I believe in this powerful something in my crops. They're dying and I need it to rain, and maybe we did something bad. And it's sort of this ingrained intuitive sense that if we only pray and beg, then somehow this divine other would, cause it to rain again. There's a lot of this cognitive dissonance and illogical dynamics when we start to unpack and, quote, deconstruct petitionary prayer. Another is that it does portray God as unfair and cruel. People just, let's just keep business as usual. Let's not think about it. And I've gotten that sentiment so many times, even from pastors. I was writing the book. I said, I want to do this in community. Let me ask the tough questions with people who talk about and lecture on prayer all over the world. Mark, you're asking too many questions. You just simply need to trust God's word. God says we should pray, then we should pray. Well, this kind of deep questioning and wrestling is not going to happen in these spaces. So think about it, in this way: thousands upon thousands of prayers can be prayed for the same ailment, yet God apparently hears those prayers and picks and chooses. Oh, I'll heal, Juan over there. I won't heal Nancy. I'll heal this person. No, I won't heal this. I mean, this sort of must be, especially when you think of all over the world, this, constant picking and choosing. When we start thinking once again, and then if God only acts on certain occasions if people pray, and I've heard this, I remember talking to one person who prayed and talked about prayer. That was his ministry. And to me, he remember him quoting John Wesley, who said, Mark, God does nothing except without believing prayer. And I'm like, I'm not sure that's the case. But there's some conundrums if that's the case. One is if people don't pray, then that means God, who has the power to stop evil events from occurring, to stop suffering with the, flick of a finger, with the, speaking into an existence that God simply chooses not to because people didn't beg him to do so. It's starting, you see the potential issues here. So God, the supposed very definition of love, allows people to become sick, to miss rent payments, to remain unregenerate, or be raped or murdered, just because other people did not pray for them to get well, for them to be safe, or have rent money, become saved. You get it. God becomes this bystander, simply who watches people suffer while doing nothing to alleviate the evil in their lives. There's something amiss here when we start really questioning these things. So to move on, because I want to have some discussions, empirical, individual, and societal concerns. We'll talk about some empirical issues here, but I really want to get into my main passion, which caused me to really write and make this a part of my clarion call in regards to petitionary prayer. So one of the largest and most expensive studies of intercessory prayer to date, and I use petitionary prayer, intercessory prayer interchangeably. Some don't. But in this context, I just will to make it easier. So a $2.4 million study. These folks were serious. This was the study, right? There were patients, they were recovering from coronary bypass surgery. And there were 3 groups. 2 of the groups were told that they may or may not receive prayer. 1 group were told that they would receive prayer. And so we had the prayer warriors kind of going to town. It was Christian and Catholic intercessory prayer warriors praying for 14 days. And they went to town. They were passionate. Let's see what God can do. Well, what do we think the results were? I'll just kind of quote what the researcher said. First, intercessory prayer itself had no effect on whether complications occurred after the CABG. Second, patients who were certain intercessors would pray for them had a higher rate of complications than patients who were uncertain but did receive intercessory prayer. Fascinating conclusions here. So much so that Newsweek came out with a headline in one of their articles, "Don't pray for me, please." Right? Because those who were actually told that they would be prayed for actually had more complications than anyone else in the other groups. So $2.4 million down the drain. Yes, petitionary prayer, intercessory prayer, at least in that study, certainly was not effective. Here's a graph of 5 studies, all in the same vein of looking at recovery mortality rates. What's interesting, just for the sake of time, is the number of people who died, right? So those who were prayed for, 116, and those who were not prayed for, 124. Is petitionary prayer effective? What's fascinating is there were many Christians after some of these studies. Wow, look at the power of prayer. Wow, because they saw that there was some effect to some level, which anyone with an astute mind and a research-minded brain would say, I'm not sure that's the case. But then there were other Christians who said, oh, well, anyway, God wouldn't acquiesce to such a research study anyway, right? Well, all that to say, there's just not a lot of empirical evidence on this stuff. Research is doomed from the start. Well, one, if you're an atheist, it certainly is doomed from the start because there's no God and it's a fantasy figure that people are praying to. But even if there was a God, and they were trying to do a legitimate study, how do you account for all the possible variables? How do you account for people who were supposedly not being prayed for, who had distant relatives who were praying for them, and other factors, about sometimes we know the psychosomatic, issues that people can have, and the levels of potential depression or quality of relationships and all kinds of variables that I don't think people were accounting for anyway. So it's doomed from the start. There are no studies that conclusively demonstrate that petitionary prayer is effective. I can't believe how many people, when I'm writing this book and I'm asking tough questions, Mark, what about the water studies and the plant studies? You see the power of words, the power of prayer. Words have power. And I'm like, well, I know. First of all, please don't bring up Masaru Emoto and his water studies where he, looked at, water and then water crystals after, exposing them to whether, saying nice things to them or saying not nice things or all kinds of weird, he's trying to see if there's a difference between love and not love via words, via pictures or other things. And what's so interesting about those studies, which he came out with a book and everyone's like, wow, all the woo-woo people were like, see, this is the power of the words. And no, please, even what that guy's name, Randy, was it James Randi? He put a $1 million bet on the table. Listen, if you can replicate these studies in a way that feels good for us as researchers and yourself, I'll give you $1 million. And they didn't take him up on that offer. So, and then there's plant studies. Yeah, it's really interesting. Expose them to nice, nice thoughts and nice words, and other, plants were exposed to sort of, curses, so to speak, saying bad things, rotten things. And they also did it with classical music and heavy metal music and stuff. It's just not helpful in the discussion. It really is not. None of that proves really anything. And they're so different because we're talking about petitionary prayer where people most of the time don't even know they're being prayed for, as opposed to a plant that is being exposed in proximity to potential music. Not helpful. So there are interesting single case reports that demonstrate healing has taken place. So I try to be really objective, try to look at the data. And there's these really interesting, single case reports. This is one of them, of gastroparesis healing, 16 years of a chronic syndrome resolved after proximal intercessory prayer. That gets into interesting dynamics when it comes to distant healing prayer versus proximal intercessory prayer. I have thoughts about that. I'm not going to get into that in this moment. Just to point out that there's some interesting phenomena where, take a case like this where apparently the tubes were removed after this young man was in a prayer meeting. Did something happen? I don't want to say no, because tubes were removed, apparently, if I'm trusting this data here. I have some, other reasons, other potential dynamics that might be involved in the healings that take place in church services such as these. And maybe we can talk about that later. My real big point here in this whole talk, well, let me start off with Herbert and Katherine Shable as sort of an illustration to talk about some of these really important dynamics. Katherine and Herbert Shable loved God, passionate about prayer, passionate about the Bible. And in 2009, they suffered the passing and the death of their 2-year-old son, Kent. But why did he die? He died because of untreated bacterial pneumonia. And why was it untreated? Because they believed solely in the power of prayer. They relegated responsibility to God instead of taking wise action to take their son to the hospital to get treated, right? So they actually got probation. I believe it was 10 years. In 2013, something happened to their 8-month-old. His name is Brandon. He also died from, I believe it was untreated bacterial pneumonia for the same reason. They believed in the power of prayer. They prayed, and both of their children died. After that, the judge let them have it, and they did receive a prison sentence after that. At the time, I said, wow, what idiotic people. I mean, how could you do such a thing? It's so vile. It's so evil. How could you let your children suffer and then die like that? But then I thought, oh boy, Mark, this is where there's a conundrum. How many times have you, because I was, at church at the time, how many times have other people prayed to God and, putting the responsibility on God to do things that are really important and needed on the earth, that allowed people to needlessly suffer and potentially even die because we thought God would take care of it? I said, Mark, this is a problem. And some fire in my belly said, this is not okay. And I want to shout this on the rooftop. And this is my thesis, that petitionary prayer is one of the largest contributors to humanity's suffering across the ages. Now, this thesis is not very welcomed in most, 99% of churches. But I firmly believe this, and I think there's a good logical rationale for believing this is the case. There's something called the bystander effect. Now, I know there's so many nuances to it, and I first came into contact with it reading a book about Kitty Genovese, who was raped, and all these people were apparently just watching it unfold, and no one took initiative to do anything about it, maybe in part because they perceived someone else would be taking care of it, and for other reasons. And over time, they said, there wasn't as many witnesses as once thought. Either way, bystander effect, seems to be some dynamic at play here. When fail intervene during crises or emergencies when they perceive others are present and aware of the event. So one sociologist said, if people are aware that the event is being witnessed by others, the responsibility felt by any individual is diffused. So you can see where I'm potentially going here. I call this the dilemma of the prayer stander effect. We have someone suffering, or we can think of that middle picture calling for help. Any one of the isms or societal issues that people pray for, any of the ailments, any of the suffering that human beings have dealt with for, some for centuries. And how many times people, God, you take care of it. God's in control. Let's pray to the sovereign God, right?
One last thing you might want to know is that the Global Center for Religious Research has established the most comprehensive international research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. But we have a big problem. See, in order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is recognized as a real mental health condition. And unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma is still in its infancy. This means that there are no exhaustive empirical studies to support what we have seen and experienced, that religious trauma exists and is a chronic problem. As it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published so far, but nothing substantially empirical. And GCRR wants to correct this gap of knowledge, and we're hoping to get your help with that. So we have set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first, most comprehensive sociological study on the existence, causes, and manifestations of religious trauma. Now, the reason we are crowdsourcing this stuff is because we were actually set to get a grant, federal grant for this research project, and then the federal government halted all funding for mental health research. So we were left holding the bag. That's why we're hoping the public can join us in this effort. All you have to do is go to gofundme.com and search for the phrase religious trauma sociological study, or you can click the link that I'm going to put in the chat box. And at the very least, please share this GoFundMe page across all your social media platforms just to get the word out about this really important research project.